It's great to engage in some learning together today on a fascinating topic, but what if I love the Greeks? Hannukah for Philosophers. And we're thrilled to partner today with our great partner, BMH-BJ, and to learn today from Rabbanit Leah Sarna, great scholar in Philly. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Rabbi Chaitovsky, to introduce Rabbanit Sarna. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Shmuley, and everyone. Welcome, everyone. Just a little premise. Greeks get a bad rap on Hanukkah, and a lot of people love the Greeks. There's a lot to admire about the Greeks. So there's clearly a tension, and Rabbanit Leah Sarna is going to help us navigate that tension and try to arrive at some parameters in which we can navigate this. She previously served, she is the faculty and director of teen programming at Drisha, a well-known learning institution in New York. She previously served as director of religious engagement at Anshe Sholom, B'nai Israel in Chicago, a leading urban Orthodox congregation. She has ordination from Yeshivat Maharat, has a BA from Yale in philosophy and psychology, and also trained at the SKA Beit Midrash for women at Migdal Oz, Drisha, and the Center for Modern Torah Leadership. I believe that's in Boston. She was a Wexner graduate fellow and a winner of the Covenant Foundation's Pomegranate Prize. Her published works have appeared in The Atlantic, Washington Post, Lair House, the Jewish Review of Books. She has lectured widely in Orthodox synagogues, Jewish communal settings around the world, and loves spreading her warm, energetic love for Torah and mitzvot with Jews of every background and in every stage of life. Rabbanit Sarna, please. Thank you.
All right. So happy Hanukkah, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I just want to apologize in advance. My it's the season of daycare diseases, and my 18-month-old brought home something horrible last week, so we're in it. But that's the beauty of Zoom. I can't possibly get you sick. So, but you know, if I go and turn off my sound for a second to hack or whatever, now you know why. Anyways, it's wonderful to be here with you over Hanukkah. And as was mentioned in my bio, I spent a great deal of my undergraduate career studying philosophy, and particularly I really fell in love with the ancients. So Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy, and then you get to Hanukkah and you're like, I think I'm supposed to hate the Greeks. How do I make sense of that? And do our texts have anything to say about it? And amazingly, they do. So today we'll look at some texts that sort of lay out the problem quickly from our Hanukkah liturgy, from the book of Maccabees. And then we'll look at some suggested, possible resolutions to it, ways to think about how to sort of fit these things together. For me, it's important because Greek literature and Greek philosophy, I discovered during my years in Chicago that I'm not the only clergy person I know who really loves to go back and back again to Greek literature. When I was an undergraduate, it was like my third semester reading Plato's Republic in a different class. Someone said to me, "Don't you get tired of Plato's Republic?" And I sacrilegiously said back to them, "Do you get tired of the Torah?" And I'm not sure I quite would say the same thing now, but that's definitely how I felt about this set of literature, of just like, wow, this is so rich and so deep, and it's really the type of thing that I read and reread with great pleasure. And that means that on Hanukkah, I have to be able to square that. So I'm going to share my screen. Alex sent out sources in advance also, if people, I don't know, or you'll put it in the chat or something, but you can also follow along with me here. Okay. And my understanding is that the way things work here is that I sort of talk at you for about 40 minutes, and then we have some Q&A at the end. So, definitely, if you have questions as we go, feel free to write them down or whatever. And I'm excited to engage after we look at some sources together. So here's from the Siddur. This is from the Al HaNisim insertion that goes into every Shmona Esrei that we say for all of Hanukkah. So we tell this story: Bimei Matidyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Chashmonai Vanav. In the days of Matityahu, Mattathias, son of Yochanan, the high priest, the Hasmonean, and his sons, when the evil Greek kingdom rose up against your people Israel, what did they do? They tried to make them forget your Torah, turn them away from your statutes, right? Like that sounds really bad. What did the Greeks do? They were religiously oppressing us. And a different narrative that goes along with that, but in more detail, comes from the first book of Maccabees, chapter 1. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, "Let us go and make covenant with the Gentiles around us, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us." So this proposal pleased this group of what the book of Maccabees is calling renegades, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom. They removed the marks of circumcision, abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. Okay, so the real voice in the tradition of like the Greeks are evil. And then actually, the king seemed to have really loved this idea. And he writes the whole kingdom saying that all should be one people, all should give up their particular customs. And all the Gentiles just said, yes, that sounds great. And even many from Israel also adopted this Greek religion. They sacrificed to idols, they profaned Shabbat. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem, all towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs that were not the customs of the Jews, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Shabbat and festivals, to defile the sanctuaries and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they should forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. Okay, so we have this really serious like Greek oppression, not we're going after you because you're ethnically Jewish, but we're going after all of your religious practices. We're raising up the profane, and we are trying to eliminate the holy, and that is the attempt by the Greeks. And beyond that, we have some halachic writing about even just the study of Greek in general. So the Mishnah in Sota says, in the war of Vespasian, the sages decreed alatarot chatanim v'ala irus. They decreed upon the crowns of bridegrooms, i.e., prohibiting the wearing of crowns, and then also upon the drums. They prohibited the use of drums. And in the war of Titus, they also decreed upon the crowns of brides. And the Shelo Yelamed et Beno Yevani. They decreed that a person should not teach his son. So why is that? Doesn't that seem pretty maladaptive in a world where people are speaking Greek? Wouldn't you think that you would need to know it? That seems pretty complicated. But here's what it's about. So the Talmud expands on that teaching in the Mishnah, Shelo Yelamed et Beno Yevani, Tenura Banan. There's a teaching by the sages, a Baraita, sages taught, so when there was a civil war amongst the kings of the Hasmonean monarchy. So what they're going to talk about are Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, who were the sons of Shlom Tzion HaMalka. And she died, and she tried to leave everything to Hyrcanus, who she had in her lifetime already appointed to be the high priest. But that didn't go well, and the two brothers ended up just fighting each other all the time. So Hyrcanus ended up outside the city walls. Aristobulus was inside the city walls of Jerusalem. So every day, the problem was the ones inside the city, right? These are all, so we should back up for a second and just say that Hasmonean kings are also all Kohanim, they're all priests. So they're very invested in the temple continuing to run, even as they are fighting with each other. So the ones inside the city are the ones who are keeping the temple running, but they don't have any of the stuff that they need. So they would lower money in a box from inside the city, and those on the outside would send up animals to be brought as sacrifices. It's a sort of funny image where it's like we're fighting with each other, but we're still going to be working together to keep the Jewish kind of cultic center running. Okay, so Hyrcanus is on the outside, Aristobulus is on the inside. The people on the inside would send money out each day, and then the people on the outside would send them up the animals that they needed for the daily sacrifices. And there was a certain elder there in Jerusalem who was familiar. So we're no longer talking about the language of Yavani, right? That was the language of the Mishnah was Greek. Now we're talking about Chokhmah Yavani. We're talking about a certain type of Greek wisdom. That's going to become important. We're going to see that later, that distinction. So now it's specifically Greek wisdom. Amar lahem, and that this old person who knew Greek wisdom said to them, Kozman she'oskim ba'avodah in mimtzerim bi'adchem. He said to the people on the outside, to the Hyrcanus people, you're never going to win for as long as the temple is still running. That's protecting them. That's supporting their side. So then what did this person suggest? Lamachar shilshalu lahem dinarim b'kupa. So tomorrow, he said, so then the next day, the money comes down in the box, and what do they send back? Helulahem chazir. They send a pig, which obviously you cannot bring as a sacrifice in the temple. And what happens with this pig? Kivan she'gia lechatzi chuma, once it gets halfway up the wall, na'atz tzipornav, it dug its hooves into the wall, nizda za'a Eretz Yisrael arba ma'ot parsa, and there was like a massive earthquake. The land of Israel shuddered, 400 parasangs. And Otasha Amru Arur Adam Shigadal Chazirim. And at that time, the sieges saw this, they said, cursed is the person who raises pigs, and more than that, Arur Adam Shilamid Livno Chokhmah Yavani. It's not even just the pig's fault. It's that guy who told us, because he understood this like Greek wisdom thing, that we should be doing this in the first place. He's out too. No one's allowed to learn this Chokhmah Yavani thing. It caused this massive like natural disaster for all of us. Okay, so now we have not only within the Hannukah story, we have Malchut Yavan Sha'ah, the evil Greek kingdom, and then this threat here, like if you don't abandon your religion and obey the commands of the king, we're going to kill all of you. But even once you have like Greek wisdom kind of infiltrating, even later in the Hasmonean time, right after Hannukah, when you have Hasmonean kings, even then you have this sense that like Greek wisdom is still causing problems. It's powerful, clearly, but what happens when you tap into that power? It causes natural disasters. It causes earthquakes. It's terrible. So we have this one version of the story where the Greeks are evil, they rise up, we defeat them, and they leave behind this kind of pervasive but desirable and powerful knowledge. And it's our job to know that we shouldn't be accessing that, right? And like, if you asked the authors of this story, well, Leah read Plato and she really liked it, they would say, of course you really liked it. It's so interesting and so powerful and it causes earthquakes, so don't learn it anyways. Like that seems to be what this story would have us think. Okay, so how do we square it? How do we make sense of it? So even within that Gemara itself, like really picking up almost from where exactly we left off, the Gemara itself is going to start to ask questions on this idea that you're not allowed to learn Greek. So the first thing they're going to say is, well, is that really so? Va'amar Rebbe, so Rabbi Nasi says, B'Eretz Yisrael lashon sursi lama. He says, why should people in Eretz Yisrael, only speak Syriac, Sursi, which is the type of Aramaic that they were speaking in Eretz Yisrael? Ella, ilashon kodesh, ilashon Yavani. They shouldn't speak Syriac. They should either speak Hebrew or Greek. Okay, so now it seems like you have Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the author of the Mishnah, saying people should learn Greek. And then Rav Yosef says, and Rav Yosef sitting in Bavel, Bavel Lashon Arami Lama, why should you speak Aramaic? Ella O Lashon Agodesh O Lashon Parsi. Either you should speak Hebrew or you should speak Persian. And they say, how do they resolve it? They say, well, Greek language is different from this specific Greek wisdom. Lashon Yevani Lachud B'chachma Yevani Lachud. So Chachma Yevani is separate from Greek language. Greek language is great, and that's good because there's also like a big kind of stream in the Jewish tradition that thinks that Greek language is particularly beautiful. You can write the Book of Esther in Greek, for example. You can also write it in English, but anyways, right, there's all sorts of like halachic ramifications even to like how much the rabbis sort of love the Greek language and admire it and think it's beautiful. So, okay, so Greek language now is fine, but we still have a problem with Chokhmah Yevani. We still have a problem with Greek wisdom. And now they're going to say, okay, but Chokhmah Yevani, Niasira, is Greek wisdom really prohibited? Because we have this tradition in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, where it says, Eni olal nafshi, my eye affected my soul, mikol b'not iri, due to all the daughters of my city. What does that mean? Elef yeladim hayu b'beit Abba. In my father, Rabban Gamliel's home, there were 1,000 children. Chamish me'ot lamdu Torah. 500 of them learned Torah. V'chamish me'ot lamdu chachma Yevani. And 500 of them learned Greek wisdom. Hold on, in the home of the prince, Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi Rabban Gamliel, they were studying Chokhmah Yevani, so it can't be prohibited if they're doing that. And okay, but it did, I mean, the only remnants of that home, he said, there's only 2 people left who were eyewitnesses who participated in this Rabban Gamliel education, but I'm telling you, this is what it was. So then they say, no, Shani shall be Rabban Gamliel de Kovim Lamalchut. So no, the house of Rabban Gamliel was different because they were very close to the monarchy, and they give evidence for it. So they talk about a certain type of haircut, a kumi haircut, which is prohibited to normal people because of the Torah's prohibition on doing things that are in the ways of the Amorites, Darkei Amori. But this one guy of Tos ben Reuven, he was allowed to do it. Why was he allowed to do it? Because Shehu Karu Malchut. He was allowed because he was close to the kingdom. He needed to be in like the latest fashion of haircuts if he was going to, let's say, represent the Jewish people to the king. He needed to kind of look good in court, maybe. And so he was allowed to have this type of otherwise prohibited haircut. And so similarly, Shal Beit Rabban Gamliel Hitzir Lahem Chokhmah Yevanit. So similarly, in that home of Rabban Gamliel, they were permitted to study Greek wisdom because they are close to the monarchy. So that's resolution number 1, right? Option number 1 is, why should we be allowed to study Greek wisdom? Well, I think in a democracy, it's not difficult to say we are all close to the monarchy. The classics are a part of our Western tradition that were certainly, known and studied and beloved by the founders of the United States. And to that end, it makes sense to read Plato's Republic because that is part of the language of our Western democracy. And therefore, we are Kovim Lamalchut. It's permitted for us because that's what it means to be Jews living in an American democracy. And that same permission that was given to the students of Rabban Gamliel is actually, in fact, given to all of us as well. So I think that's model number 1 that I want to say, is that a way to think about it is, I have a position as a voting citizen in this country that requires of me a certain educational a certain education and a certain language and a certain engagement with culture and philosophy. And the Greeks are just part of that, and they've been part of that, for the last, since the year, whatever, 200, when earlier than that, probably 100, when Rabban Gamliel walked the world. And And we can walk in that path too. It's as if we're students in the home of Rabbanit. That's Greek wisdom. The other thing that we talk about and that our tradition knows a lot about in terms of Greek literature is the literature part, is Homer. So Homer appears quite early in our tradition. He appears in the Mishnah. So the first reference to it is in the Mishnah in Yadayim 4:6. It's an amazing Mishnah for all kinds of reasons, but we're not gonna I don't think we have time to really look at all of it in depth, even though it's very, very fun, and I definitely recommend learning Mishnah Yadayim in your own time. But basically here we have a debate between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, where the Sadducees and the Mishnah identifies as a Pharisee document. So the person who's supposed to come off well in this conversation are the Pharisees, just to be clear. So the Sadducees say, we complain against you Pharisees because you say that the Holy Scriptures defile the hands and the books of Homer do not defile the hands. So if we're looking for kind of a range of literature, it seems like we have Holy Scriptures, Kifei Kodesh on one side, and Homer on the total other end of the spectrum in terms of holiness. Maybe like the book holiness spectrum goes from the Torah to Homer as like the least possible holy thing. But the Sadducees are saying the mapping of impurity onto that holiness of books spectrum seems opposite. Why would you say that holy books defile the hands and not holy books like Homer don't defile the hands? You should say touching Homer makes your hands impure, not that touching the Torah makes your hands impure. And then they go through this whole amazing example that we're not going to look at in depth. But then they say the principle they come up to is Lefi chivatan hi tumatan. Lefi chivatan hi tumatan. According to the affection for them, so too is their uncleanness. When we want people to treat something with respect and care, that is when we assign it levels of impurity, actually. Because when something is impure, you have to be really careful about it. You have to be prepared. Oh, I touched this thing. What do I have to do before? What do I have to do after? And the right to the argument with books is like, if I could just be like eating a snack while I'm looking at a book, then I'll destroy the book. I'll get grease all over it. It'll get eaten by animals. So actually, I need to make the book that I want to preserve, I need to make it give off impurity so that the book will be safe from my snacking while reading habits or whatever. And so the more beloved something is, the more we protect it by assigning to it impurity. That's the argument of this Mishnah. And they say, Sifrei Homerus, they're less beloved. The books of Homer, they're not precious. We don't love them in the same way, so they do not defile the hands. We have another reference to the books of Homer. This time it's not explicitly in the Mishnah. The Yerushalmi is going to spell it out. So, because part of the question here is like, okay, so Homer's for sure not Tanakh, and it's not Chaviv. Maybe it's not beloved in the same way. It's not precious in the same way as Tanakh. But it doesn't actually tell you anything about whether I'm allowed to read it or not, or touch it or not. All I know is I can touch it while I'm snacking, which is fine, you know? So the Mishnah and then the Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin shed further light on the status of these books. So the Mishnah says, this is a list of people who have no share in the world to come, even if they do lots of other mitzvot, still no share. Here's how you can lose your share in the world to come. You can say, Ein tchiyat hametim min Torah. You can say there's no resurrection of the dead derived from the Torah. Ve'ein Torah min hashamayim. You can say the Torah didn't come from the heavens. The apikoros and the apikoros. So who is that? Maybe it's like someone who treats Torah scholars with contempt or something like that. Rabbi Akiva adds on to that list, Af hakoreh b'sfarim hachitzoniyim. This includes someone who reads from external literature. So what does that mean, right? Like that could mean the only books you're allowed to own, the only books you're allowed to read are Torah books. And remember, like we're talking about a time where like this number of books that you can see over my shoulder would have been inconceivable, right? Like you have one book on your shelf, like that book should be the Torah. And so in that world, I could actually understand, like in a world where you get to have one book in your home out of any book on earth, and you're a Jew and you pick Homer to be that book, whoa, that's so problematic, right? So I can understand actually construing that choice to be, yeah, that Jew who chooses some other book of literature over Torah, like that's a huge kind of heresy. I can understand that, but that's actually not where the Yerushalmi takes it. So the Yerushalmi says in Sanhedrin 28a, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Afa Koreh Besfarim Achitzoniyim. It brings Rabbi Akiva's opinion, people who read external books of literature. What are those external books of literature? For example, Ben Sira. And then he says, so apocryphal books, wisdom literature that didn't make its way into Tanakh, like books that are extra canonical. But Sifrei Humerus v'kol Sfarim shenichtavu mikan ve'helach. So, but books of Homer and all books written from now on, hakoreh b'hem kakoreh be'igaret. It's neutral. It's like you're reading financial documents. It's not holy. It's not religious. But it's like, like reading a bill, like reading your credit card bill. You should probably do that. Like maybe that's even a good thing to do. And maybe there are limitations on when you're allowed to do that. So for example, there's a pretty good argument to be made that you're not allowed to read igarets. You're not allowed to read financial documents on Shabbat. Maybe you could say, it comes with all of the halachic weight of reading an igaret, which is to say you're allowed to do it, but there's limitations on doing it in the right time and in the right place. And we'll see more about that going forward. But just within these little texts in Sanhedrin, or in Yadayim and Sanhedrin, right? Yadayim leaves open the option that, yeah, it's not a Torah text, Homer, and it doesn't get treated within our Tuma Tahara purity, impurity book structure as a holy text, for sure not. It's not beloved in the same way, but doesn't mean you're a terrible person if you read Homer or that you are participating in the evils of Greek culture. It just means like, this is a nice book. It's not the same as the Torah. And I think we see that same type of thing even more so in the Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin, where it's like, yep, this book, it's just neutral. It's not a religious book. It's not holy, but it's neutral. Okay, so now we're going to see something even that takes it from, right? So option number one, which we saw in Sota, was, well, maybe there is really a prohibition on reading these books, but there's an exemption carved out for people who participate in government, and maybe that's really all of us now. That was option number one. Option number two was, maybe these books actually are just kind of neutral. They're not Torah. Don't treat them like Torah, but they're neutral, and it's okay. It's like reading a bill. The Shvilei Emunah is written by Rabbi Meir ibn al-Debi, who's the grandson of the Rosh. His book was published in 1360 in Toledo. And he has a different take. His take is, probably you should read these books, and probably there's real wisdom in them, and maybe it's even Jewish wisdom. So I'll just read you a tiny bit of what he says he found it. So we don't know. Did he actually find this written somewhere, or did he invent this story? Hard to say, but it's kind of incredible. So here goes. Matzati katuv ki Aristo hayavani asher kol chachmei hanachkar nigarim acharav v'shoavim misvarav. So I found it written that Aristotle, the Greek, that all the wise scientists follow after him and they draw out of his books. Shahaya Rabo Shal Alexandros Migdal, and he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. That is true. Jamalach al Kol Alam, who was the king of the whole world. Kasher Kavash Alexandros Yerushalayim. So when Alexander the Great captured Jerusalem, he shlit la Aristo Rabo al Otsar Shlomo alav hashalom. He gave Aristotle free access, free reign over the library of King Solomon. V'az chakar v'darash al sifrei Shlomo. So Aristotle studied all of King Solomon's books, And he took them, v'lakcha v'hatikim al shmo, and he copied them in his own name. V'hosifu toyot mishalo, and like all plagiarists, he added in some mistakes somewhere. V'az ganaz hasfarim shel Shlomo kedei la'atot ha'olam, and then he hid the books of King Solomon in order to fool the world. Sharisto atzmo chiburim mishikul da'atem, and into thinking that Aristotle himself wrote these books out of his own mind. And then he says, then Rabbi Meir Ibn Al-Debi, the author, says, okay, so when I saw this story, Alat Libi B'Hashem, I was so grateful and I was so joyous. And I said, yes, now it is known, Achinu Da Hadavar, that the origins and the foundations of all wisdom, Ki Yesodei Chachamot Asher Biyad Adon V'Yishmael, all wisdom that is found amongst Islam and Christianity, Hen Hine Hayu Livnei Yisrael, was previously belonging to the Jewish people, and they are true things, and they are ours. And therefore, right, with that idea, that actually opens up the doors of study to say, oh, when I'm studying Aristotle, I'm not studying Greek wisdom. Ma pitom, I'm studying Jewish wisdom that the Greeks plagiarized from us. That the source of all, I'm seeing someone being like, that's ridiculous. Which is totally fine. That's totally a fine way to think about it. Do not have to buy anything that the Shvilei Emunah is selling to you. But I do think that there's something very sort of beautiful about this idea of all knowledge is interconnected, and like Jewish, ancient Jewish wisdom can be reflected and found in other streams of wisdom, because there's like a unity of truth, maybe. I think, sometimes in a postmodern world, we're anxious about saying things like that. But maybe I'm not as like postmodern as people would want me to be. But I still kind of think that there is sort of a unity of truth, and it can be found in multiple places. And that's what opens up doors to finding it in other places, because if the divine is the source of all of that truth, then it's all just collecting sparks. But in any event, so that's what this idea is quite different from the previous ones, where we had seen, maybe in certain circumstances it's fine, or you can treat it like as if you're reading a bill, but it's not actually ours and it's not actually holy. Here would be to say, no, it's actually holy and it's actually ours. Okay, so now we're jumping. This I guess is around the same time as we're jumping to a different part of Spain. So we were in Toledo, and now we're in Valencia and Algiers with the Rivash, and he's getting these exact sort of same questions. The Rivash is a halachist, so he's going to write about it in different ways. But he's looking at that first Gemara that we saw, and saying, okay, there's a prohibition on Chokhmah Yavani, on Greek wisdom. Does that mean that we're supposed to also distance ourselves from, and he's going to address directly, Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. And so then he's going to say, then he goes on to say, sorry, before we get there, let me just say what he's going to say, is that he's going to really narrow what Chokhmah Yavanit is. So it's not all Greek philosophy, it's the specific type of like magical Greek wisdom thing that one elder who in the Hasmonean times kind of gave them bad advice based off of. But it's not Aristotle necessarily, says the Rivash. So here's where he says that. So Pirush Chokhmah Yavanit Remizal Avad, Oshiad Zavor Satum Vechida V'Lashon Yavanit Kipirushi Veloya Iser Klal Rapi Mnei Ma'aseh Shahaya. So he says Greek wisdom, it refers to these types of gestures, enigmatic statements, riddles. It was only prohibited because of the story, and it's like the narrow thing that's being discussed in the story, and not all wisdom that came from anyone who called themselves a Greek. So he's really kind of narrowing the definition involved in that story. But then he says, it's important to recognize that there are problematic or like theologically problematic ideas that come out of Greek wisdom. So he says, they try and uproot principles of our holy Torah, and he brings out two that he particularly finds problematic. Chidush ha'olam v'hashgachar Hashem yitbarach b'pratei hamina enoshi. So those are creation ex nihilo and God's personal divine providence intervention within people. So Aristotle doesn't believe in either of those things. And the Rivash says, like if you're reading the physics and the metaphysics, that's a problem because Aristotle really goes out of his way to disprove things that Jews in the Torah hold to be in a different way. And so is there any hayesh sifrei minim yoter me'elu? Is there a greater kind of book of heresy than those that bring examples and proofs that undermine principles of the Torah? Right? Hayesh sifrei minim yoter me'elu shemivim muftim v'rayot la'achlish ikarei Torah. And then he says, like there are amazing scholars in Jewish history who have delved deeply into Greek literature, and he talks about at length about the Rambam and about Gersonides, and he says, those people, like they, first of all, before he started learning Greek literature, claims the Rivash, who lamad kodem l'chein kol Torah kula. Before he started learning Greek literature, he had learned the entire Torah in its bishleimut, in its fullness and perfections. He learned laws and narratives, Tosefta, Sifra, Sifrei, all of the Talmuds. And you can see that because he wrote the Mishnah Torah, and the Rambam has this like extraordinary legal code. You know that the Rambam really knew the Torah cold, and the Rivash is saying he did all of that before he turned his attention to Greek wisdom. And then, in order to, in order to respond to the heretic, he wrote the Moran, the Guide to the Perplexed, which clearly turns on his knowledge and understanding of Aristotle. I'll just mention, as like a Aristotle and Rambam lover, it's interesting to me that the Rivash doesn't talk about the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avot, the Shmona Prakim, which is fully just a rehashing of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but in like a very beautiful, very like Torah kind of way. And Maimonides fesses up to it, meaning in his introduction to that introduction, he talks about taking wisdom. That's what his famous line, take wisdom from wherever it comes, is in that introduction, because he knows that that's exactly the project that he's doing in his introduction to Pirkei Avot, to Ethics of the Fathers, is integrating so much of Aristotle's wisdom about balancing different traits in the middle path and or the mean, or whatever you want to call it, and some like Maimonides there writes beautifully about friendship, and that's also all based on Aristotle. All kinds of amazing things are in there, and so you would think that would be. I mean, I think it's just not the question that the Rivash was asked, but you would think that would be what he would talk about here. I've always been a little disappointed in this text because of that. Anyways, he says also, right, the Rambam, he learned the whole Torah before he started doing any of this. He says, nevertheless, Maimonides was drawn a little bit after some of the proofs of Aristotle. He was convinced a little bit by then, and Maimonides would say, yeah, that's me just like learning truth from wherever it comes. But the Rivash would say, that's really bad. And if you're going to read something and it's going to teach you something that's against the Torah, that's very scary. And even the Rambam was convinced by it, and so it should be even scarier to you because you're not the Rambam. And so he says, everyone should kind of make an argument for himself Maimonides and Gersonides, these two kings, lo amdu raglehem b'mishor, they couldn't stand on the straight and narrow, regarding some of the things that they learned from Aristotle. Ich na'amud anachnu asher lo re'inu me'orot le'ercham. How much more so we who cannot compare in our brilliance to them. So the Rivash doesn't say it's prohibited. He says these texts are, and he says, first thing he says is these texts are not what the Talmud is prohibiting. And then he says, but you know what? Like, keep your eyeballs in your brain. Like, there's something scary about these texts. They're very convincing. There's something quite threatening about that. Pay attention as you're reading it. And I think there's something that's, I'm not sure you need to agree with the Rivash's exact application of that idea in order to agree that anytime you read, you have to read critically. And just because you read something and you get drawn into its world, right? Like if you read Aristotle and said, yes, everything in here is true, then like you would just go and enslave someone, like there's so much in there that's problematic, and not everything that we read should we adopt as truth. And learning, it's really the challenge of our generation, especially as computers start generating nonsense that sounds very truthy. Really learning how to read for truth and read for accuracy and ask difficult questions becomes even more essential than ever. And so I think is that to be the takeaway from the Rivash, who's essentially saying, yes, you can read this stuff, but you got to be so careful with how you're reading. To me, that does resonate as an important kind of takeaway and message. And the last little text I'll bring here, and then I'll conclude and we'll open up for questions, is this one, which is also really great. So Sha'al, we're back in the Talmud. Sha'al ben Dama ben Achotosha Rabbi Ishmael at Rabbi Ishmael. So Ben Dama, the son of Rabbi Ishmael's sister, asked his uncle Rabbi Ishmael, Kagonani. So someone like me, says Ben Dama, Shalamad kol Torah kula. I learned the entire Torah. Am I allowed to study Greek wisdom? And then Rabbi Yishmael responds with a verse, the verse says, Lo yamush sifra Torah zani picha v'agita bo yomam v'layla. This Torah scroll shall not depart from your mouth. You shall contemplate it day and night. So then what Rabbi Yishmael says to him is, Tzei uvdok sha'a she'ino lo min hayom v'lo min halayla. Go and search for an hour that is neither part of the day nor part of the night, and then you're allowed to learn Greek wisdom. And what I think it is quite helpful actually about this, it sounds ridiculous and dismissive. I'll just own that, right? It sounds like Rabbi Ishmael says yes, but not within the 24-hour period. But I do think that any time that we are spending time on something, there's opportunity cost to that. And I think that's the real message of Rabbi Ishmael's statement is, well, you're studying this stuff and you love it, and that's great, but at what cost? And I think that's similar to what I was saying about the Rivash, where maybe like the specific application of the thing doesn't resonate as much, but the idea that we should be asking ourselves, oh, this seems very convincing. Am I correct to be convinced by it? And here, wow, I love this and it's so wonderful. And still, we should always be asking ourselves, is this the right use of my time? Time is one of our most precious resources. And, if instead of reading Greek literature, I could be working with Rav Shmuley to help alleviate suffering somewhere. Like, wow, that's a real consideration, and I should be thinking about that. I should be thinking about that seriously. But I think at the end of the day, what we can say, and I'll stop sharing for now, is that we presented and seen together a lot of different avenues towards making sense out of what does it mean to love Greek wisdom and Greek philosophy and Greek literature. And none of these would say, well, it's the same as Torah, and like you can put down your Brejit and pick up your Plato, and those are identical. But we've seen different ways of making sense of how to fit that love in. Does it make me a better person or a better citizen? Does it add to my wisdom of the world? Does it add to my understanding of the Torah, which I think is not inconceivable? My spouse, actually, that's like what he does. He's a Bible scholar, and he writes about comparisons between Plato and Tanakh, and he feels that those comparisons deeply increase our ability to understand Tanakh. And so actually it really is to study Torah, we need to study these things. But with with that permission, though, all of the risks associated with spending our time on anything. What else could I be doing in this time? And also all the risks associated with new ideas, or in this case, really old ideas, but really any ideas that we have to read everything with careful eyes and question and evaluation, and not just accept things because, oh, it's Aristotle, it must be true. But we certainly would not want to adopt that perspective. Okay, so I think we'll take questions if people have any.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna. We'd love to open it up to questions or comments. Please feel free to raise your hands, and then you can unmute, and I can call on people, or you can always use the chat as well. Hi, Judy.
Hi. I had two thoughts about this that just kind of were nagging at me while we're reading these things. One is the Hasidic sects, where they do not allow their children to study arithmetic or science or anything practical, even English, although they're American citizens. That's one. The other is Kabbalah, where you're not supposed to study it until you're 35 and you're married and you have whatever the other, and you have to have learned a lot of Torah. So I think the danger that those two things are worried about is that you'll get carried away by exciting ideas that are other than Torah. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of, well, okay. Let me start where you started by saying that, I don't plan to educate my children in that way, but I also don't love like criticizing other Jewish communities. We're in a pluralistic space, obviously. But I would say like the way I think about it is, and I know some people here were kind of laughing at that source that it was like, oh, Aristotle discovered King Solomon's trove of wisdom and called it his own. But to me, there's something very appealing about this idea that all truth has one root and contains divinity and the ability to inspire us and make us better people and have better access to God. And so the way that I was raised in modern Orthodox schools, where we went from Talmud class to biology class to history class to Chumash class, and that was very purposeful, that the day was not divided, because the idea was that it all should feel, all education, all learning, all growth should feel like Torah. And so that's kind of how I grew up, and I still really, really, really believe that. I also so to say like, oh, I'm going to study something else and it's going to take away from this, like, no, studying something else is the study of Torah, as long as you're doing it right and as long as you're organizing your time well. And so yeah, I think that's kind of, did that answer your question? Sort of.
I think it's the best we can address it, because unless we are going to become insular and never interact with the rest of the world, knowledge of the rest of the world is important for us to have. And that includes things like medicine, if you think about Maimonides.
For sure. Yeah. Right. I mean, that what you just said is also important, because for Maimonides, and really up until like quite recently in the history of knowledge, like medicine and like science and philosophy were not different fields until like Descartes. Like until you had the development of the scientific method, which is not for another like hundreds of years after these texts that we were looking at. It's like that's when you start to have, but even like Isaac Newton was a philosopher, like Leibniz was a philosopher, even though he create like whatever, like you would also study him in a math class or a physics class. So the distinction between philosophy math, science, medicine. For Aristotle, those were all one thing. And it took a really long time to kind of have the divisions that we do now. And recognizing that is important because it's also important to recognize that the knowledge categorizations that we have now are also kind of fake, like they're invented and recent. And I think that's just like, no one ever tells you that when you go to college, like, oh, it's in the philosophy department, but it could have been in the biology department or the poli-sci department or the gender department, because those things, they're all kind of, the boundaries are messy. Anyways.
Thank you. Hi, Stuart, and then Bob next.
Toda Rabbah. Rabbanit, how did the rabbis feel about the purity of Hebrew scripture translated into Greek? For example, did the Septuagint or Greek Esther defile the hands?
I believe not. I believe it did not. I'm not 100% certain on that because I didn't like freshen up on that before this class, but I believe that it does not.
Thank you. Bob, and then Carl and Jenny.
Okay, so my question is related to Stuart's. There was the Greek translation of the Tanakh, and like there were Jewish communities like the one in Alexandria where there was a certain integration of Jewish tradition and Greek culture. And does all of that sort of play into this at all? I mean, does that history, like, how did the rabbis relate to that history?
I don't think it's a great question. And I think it's a better question than answers exist to, or if there are good answers, I don't know them. I wouldn't be surprised to hear there's some scholars who are working on that right now, because we're learning more and more about those communities all the time. There's also Elephantine, which is like, there's just there were a few different communities in Egypt that were quite Hellenized, but that sometimes they had their own kind of cultic centers, like they had their own temple, like there's a Second Temple period is crazy. And the Jews in the diaspora at that time were doing all sorts of wild stuff that we're just kind of starting to learn about and piece together. So I don't think I have like an awesome answer to that, but I bet that the more we learn about those communities, the more we'll be able to read texts like the ones I presented to you from the Talmud and start to understand them differently, because we can probably assume that the rabbis like knew about those communities and had feelings about them, but until we kind of have more details, it's hard to recreate what exactly that was or what it looked like. But I definitely think that's a really interesting piece of the puzzle. But also the rabbis are engaged in a fight for their own legitimacy. So they're not like we think, oh, the rabbis totally won, but like we only know that in retrospect. So at the time, there were all these other communities doing all this other crazy stuff, and they weren't the world's greatest pluralists. So I guess that's what I'll say. But there certainly are people who are really, really working on that question right now.
Thank you.
Hi, is it Jenny?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask Rabbanit Sarna if either you have written about this or if there are some resources you can recommend. It's all very interesting. I'd like to know of some more resources if you have any to recommend.
I have not written about this. I'm trying to think off the top of my head who has. I did definitely. I put this together a few years ago, and there were some articles that I read while I was putting this together, but they're not like at top of mind right now. But if I can go back and recreate it, I'll try and send it your way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Rabbanit Sarna. It's always a pleasure to learn with you. And just want to let everyone know about our next class, which will be next Thursday on December 21st, Radical Jewish Views of God, Maimonides versus Spinoza at 1 p.m. Mountain Time with Rabbi Micah Streifer. And Rabbi Chaitovsky?
My video got turned off, and I just wanted to say thank you very much. It was very wonderful. I went to a very right-wing yeshiva in Philadelphia where they certainly believed in Torah only. And I remember having a conversation with the religious advisor, the Mashgiach Ruchani, the spiritual director. And he said, I noticed that you do a lot of reading. You know that everything you need to find is in Torah. And I said, I absolutely believe everything is in Torah. I just don't know how to yank it out of Torah on my own. So I need literature, and I need math, and I need history and philology and all these other disciplines to help yank it out. And yeah, I believe it's Torah only, but I believe in order to support that, you can look elsewhere, including Greek philosophy and who knows where else. So
Absolutely. It's a beautiful articulation. Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today.